a stroll around Tate Britain. And before I get started this week, we're talking about revolutionary times. And I thought I would spend a little time talking about what I meant by revolution between 1780 and 1810. And to illustrate that, I've chosen to display this particular picture, which obviously is in the Louvre. It isn't in Tate Britain, but it enables me to talk about what I mean by revolution. The most famous revolution, of course, is the French Revolution of 1789, but this isn't what's being illustrated here. This is by Eugène Delacroix, and it's liberty leading the people. And it's it's an illustration of both the, well, by Delacroix, it's an illustration of the July Revolution of 1830, when Charles X was overthrown. But I don't want to get too bogged down in French history, only insofar as it affects art. So Britain was at war with France between 1793 and 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. And what that meant for art was that during that period, British artists couldn't travel to the continent, couldn't exchange ideas easily. And so British art became separated from continental art and started going in its own direction. I think quite significant move. And so we have artists like William Blake, Turner, Constable, who start to take British art in a new and original direction. So that's one significance. I should have said we were at war with France, except for 1802, the Peace of Amiens, where a number of artists actually traveled to the continent during that year. But apart from that 1 year, we were separated from continental art. Prior to the French Revolution was the American War of Independence. And although the date that's most often discussed is 1766, the war didn't finish till 1783. And so it was, and in fact, George Washington didn't become first president until 1789, the year that the French Revolution started. So it was what I'm trying to say is that it was one revolution leading into another. In Britain, our revolution, if that's the right word, took place 100 years before with the Civil War. I won't go into whether that was a revolution or not. Some people say it was simply a fight between the aristocratic landowners and their representatives in Parliament and the monarchy as to who had the most power. So it wasn't revolution in the true sense. It was a fight for control of the country between the monarchy and the aristocracy. And the true revolution, if you like, of the dissenters and the levellers was never took place. That was followed, of course, by where we use the word revolution, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But that was really I'm going into too much detail here, but that was really the sort of consolidation of the power of Parliament and the representative role and lack of power of the monarchy, the Glorious Revolution. So it was a time of revolution, and that had these revolutions had significant impact on British art, which is our subject for today. So let's move. Oh, well, before I move on, I should actually say a few things about this very famous painting. What we see in the center of this pyramidal structure is the goddess, a combination of the goddess of liberty, one of the three aims of the revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. And the goddess of liberty is represented not as a goddess, but as, and this was criticized at the time, an ordinary woman, partly dressed dirty, leading people forward. She was described by some critics as looking like a prostitute. But she represents Marianne, the figure, the symbol of the French Revolution. And she's carrying the flag of the revolution, which after 1830 became the flag of France, the tricolore. And around her, I think one of the most significant things you can see is on the far left, you see the chap with the sword. He is dressed in clothes that indicate that he is a common working man, but next to him, the chap with the top hat is a member of the bourgeois. So in other words, it's a revolution of all classes joining together to overthrow the monarchy, existing power structure. But I think I'll move on. I've said enough about this painting. Let's get back to Tate Britain. I'm taking the usual route down the centre, across to the first room, the Tudor room, then through the 1650 room, the Stuart room, and round the two rooms here that we covered last week, through to the 1780 room. There's about 26 paintings in this room, from Gainsborough to Thomas Lawrence, and I'll be covering as many as I can in the time today. So let's move on quickly. Remember the painting here by Joshua Reynolds. We've just come through this door, turned left, and we're going round the room this way. And I'll talk about the first three paintings I've got marked here. Let's start with this Joshua Reynolds. Did I say Thomas Reynolds just now? Joshua Reynolds of Lady Talbot. The dress she's wearing is not the fashionable dress of the period. It's similar, but it's inspired by a Grecian dress. And this is typical. The portraits of women were often inspired by, associated with symbols of the classical period, and wearing it's not really a Grecian dress, but a dress inspired, flowing robes was one of the ways that was done. But there are other ways in this picture. She's got her hand on a jug, an urn. What would you call it? I suppose it's more like a jug containing oil, which is just poured on those burning coals, giving rise to that incense smoke coming up, which is a tribute to the Roman goddess behind her of Minerva, associated with wisdom and the arts. So we see here the combination of the colors going back to Titian, a Titianesque, a Titian-like painting, which Reynolds is sort of intentionally invoking those feelings, because he is raising this portrait above a mere simulacrum, a mere picture of the likeness of somebody, into the grand manner, a picture of that invokes ideas of the classical period through those symbols that he uses. She was, let me put up another picture. This is not in the Tate, it's in LA, but it was originally painted in Italy by Bertoni, and it's a portrait of her husband, John Talbot. And again, painted in Italy, it's associated with classical ideas, but here he's not wearing classical dress. He's wearing the conventional formal clothing that he would have worn on the Grand Tour. And this again was normal. So behind him, there's two famous, well, a famous sculpture of Mars, the statue there, and the Medici vase, which is in the Uffizi Gallery, just behind his left elbow. And what the way that this was normally, that these portraits were undertaken, is that the man would go on the grand tour. He would have his portrait painted by an Italian artist in Italy in this sort of style, with symbols of the ancient classical world all around him. He would then come back home and commission a portrait of his wife in, and this might be some years later, as it is in this case, it's 9 years later, he gets married and commissions this picture of his wife in these classical clothes, and that again was normal. So we often see a pair of pictures, husband and wife, with those sorts of, with classical attributes, but with those sorts of differences between them. One done in Italy, one done in the UK as a matching portrait. I won't go into more detail. I was going to talk a bit about the imagery, the bas relief on the urn, but let's move on from this picture back to the room and talk about this picture by Romney, George Romney. Now, it was originally called A Lady in a Brown Dress, but later, I think in the 19th century, there was, they didn't like the idea of an anonymous portrait with, they like to have a story, the Victorians, and so it was renamed The Parsons Daughter, and we can see both of those titles here. Lady in a Brown Dress was the original title. The Parsons Daughter invokes ideas of associations and stories that who this woman might be, and her look and her dress positioning her perhaps as a parson's daughter, but it was just invented. We don't know who it was. We haven't been able to discover who it was, even with research done recently. Now, Romney, I don't know how many of you would have heard of George Romney, but he was one of the most successful portrait painters, along with the two you would have heard of, Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough. Maybe Romney was the third most popular portrait painter of society at the time. But he's best known, I think, if you have heard of him, as the, what's the right word for it? But let's put it this way, he fell in love with, his muse was Emma Hamilton. And we know what Emma Hamilton looked like because he painted something like 60 portraits of Emma Hamilton, who of course is best known as Mistress of Lord Nelson. So George Romney, it wasn't that she wasn't his mistress, he was much older than her. In fact, in this portrait, it's believed that she was 17. Some people recently have argued that she was a bit older than that, but he met her. This is an early portrait. He met her when she was about 17, and he was born in 1734. So let me do a quick calculation. He was 46 when he met her. But he was inspired by her, I think that's the best way of putting it, and just continued to use her as a model and to paint, as I said, over 60 portraits of her. And if you have heard of George Romney, it's probably through one of his portraits of Emma Hamilton. I just chose this one because it was an early portrait of Emma Hamilton. He he was born in Cumbria, and he was not wealthy by any means. His father was a cabinet maker, but he could draw from an early age. He studied with a local artist in Cumbria, but he he left Cumbria, Kendal, in fact, and he was married by then, and he actually left his wife and son and daughter to seek his fortune in London. And surprisingly, he left in 1762, but he didn't return till 1799. So almost some over 30 years later. But he did support them. So he regularly sent money to them in Cumbria, but I think occasionally he might have visited, but essentially he stayed in London. In the year after he came to London, he won second prize of 50 guineas for a painting of the death of General Wolfe, which you might remember I've spoken about before, but the version I've spoken about before was Benjamin West, the death of General Wolfe. His version, Romney's version, predates Benjamin West's version. But the important thing, I think, is that for no apparent reason, Joshua Reynolds reduced the prize arbitrarily, halved it from 50 guineas to 25 guineas. And this resulted in George Romney having a lifelong aversion, or hatred might be a better word, of Joshua Reynolds. And as a result, Romney never exhibited at the Royal Academy, never asked to join, and that meant he never found royal commissions, because royalty sought, if you like, the comfort of being painted by an academician. They knew, if you like, they were being painted by one of the best artists. The following year, Romney won second prize again and was awarded the 50 guineas. So, and he started a couple of years later, or 4 years after that, he painted a portrait that made him famous, and he started to get lots of commissions in society. And so he became quite wealthy through these commissions, although he never painted royal commissions. And this enabled him to visit Italy for 3 years and buy a large house. And he did incur debts, and his dissolute brother incurred large debts, which he had to pay off. But by then he was making so much money that he was able to pay off his brother's debts and his own debts, send money back to Cumbria, and continue as a successful artist until, as I said, 1799, he went back to Cumbria, basically because he was very ill, and his wife nursed him for the last 2 years of his life, or the last 2 or 3 years of his life. So let's move on. So that's a little bit about Romney. I won't go into the life in so much detail of John Singleton Copley. He was an American artist that came to Britain in 1781. When this was painted, the American Civil War was still, or War of Independence was still in progress, and a lot of Americans regarded themselves as British, and it was a British colony, and he lived in Boston, and Boston he regarded as an outpost of a small colony, if you like. And to make a name for himself, he felt he had to go to London. So he traveled to London to make his name. Now, during the war with America, France was supporting America, and they were being harassed on the seas, sending supplies, troops and equipment across to America by obviously the British Navy, but by ships, privateers that was stationed in Jersey, and Jersey is only, I think it's 12 miles off the coast of France. So France decided to invade Jersey in 1781, and what they did is they went to the governor's office, Field Marshal Conway, and they forced him to surrender. However, the commander of the garrison, 24-year-old Major Pearson, refused to surrender. He rejected the surrender and led a successful counterattack. Right, so what we see here is the central square of St. Helier, the capital of Jersey. And right in the middle of the painting, the man who has just been shot, who's being held up by his friends, is Major Pearson. His servant to the left of him, the black man with a musket, is just shot the sniper who killed Major Pearson. And you can see him, well, let me point to him here. The sniper has been shot. Now, in fact, it was a sniper hiding in a building that shot Major Pearson at the beginning of the battle. But the truth of the battle has been modified slightly here, and Pearson is shown shot at the height of the battle, just at the moment of victory beneath the Union flags. Or I think, in fact, I've done some research, I can't identify them precisely, but I think these are the two regimental flags of one of the regiments, the 72nd Regiment that was stationed on Jersey. So, incidentally, these figures over here, the civilians fleeing the battle, were modelled by his wife. This is his wife, that is John Singleton Copley's wife, daughter, I believe, and son, and their nurse, modelled for this painting. And these other figures here, these figures here are all portraits of the people who are actually there. I don't know about in this painting, but it was common practice for the artist to be paid by the people in the painting of this type, group paintings, for them to be included, to have their portrait included. And this became extremely popular painting as an engraving. And in fact, the painting was commissioned because the publisher who commissioned it knew that he could sell a lot, because at a time when we were losing all the battles in America, this was one small victory that was celebrated throughout Britain, and the engraving sold extremely well. And a quote from the time, "The chorus of praise reached all the way to Buckingham Palace." So it made Copley's name. It was a print that everybody had on their wall, and it was one small victory, which didn't really last very long, because 2 years later, the American War of Independence finished with our defeat and America's victory. So let me go back to the room and turn further round to a doorway where you can come straight through. This door here leads into the Devine Gallery. You can come straight through the Tudor room into this room. Let's turn again and look at the end of the room, and I'll talk about I think I'll talk about all three of these pictures that are marked here. How are we doing? Yes, we're doing all right for time. This is by William Beachy. Again, another probably less well known, but another well-known artist of the period. And what we see are two wealthy, well-dressed young people, and the girl is giving a coin, it looks like a penny, to the beggar boy, who is older than them, but is in rags and is hunched over, maybe suffering from rickets, and accepting the coin. This is an example of, in fact, this picture gets darker and darker as I talk about it. This is an example of philanthropic kindness, which was just beginning. It's also an example of the representation of children in a new way, which was just beginning and becoming popular. And it's also an example of a little story being told, a subject picture, although it is also a portrait. I'll talk about who these children are in a moment. So it's a portrait of the children, but it's also a story around them. And the story is associated both with rural poverty and philanthropic kindness. But we'll discover in a moment that the kindness isn't all that it's made out to be. The children are the children of Sir Francis Ford. Now, Sir Francis Ford was one of those who at the time, say round about the 1790s, was very strongly pro-slavery. He owned a plantation in Barbados which employed slave labor. Incidentally, he lived at this time, 1793, in Ember Court in Thames Ditton, down Esher Road, although the building that he lived in, the Ember Court building, has long since been demolished, but that's the estate that it was based in, the estate that's now Ember Court. And one of his arguments for slavery is that the slaves, his slaves in Barbados, were better treated than the poor, the poorest, that is, in England, in the slums of the cities. The death rate in the slums in England was 50% for children under, only half the children lived to the age of 5. And so so that we can now look at this painting in a slightly different way. Now we've learned that this painting is propaganda pro-slavery in a way, because what he's saying is that the poor children of England are worse off than his slaves in Barbados. He's obviously ignoring the fact that they are slaves and that it's morally wrong to enslave people. He's making an economic argument, if you like, and that his children are doing their best, if you like, to support the poor of England who are much worse off. That's what is being shown in this painting. So as I said just now, the more you learn about it, the darker this painting becomes. Incidentally, in terms of timing, one of the first books to be written describing conditions on a slave ship was published, I think it was around about the early 1790s. I can't remember the exact year. And slavery, or that is the trade in slaves, was abolished in 1807 in Britain. So that's just to put the time of this picture into context. This was also the time, coming back to the art world, this was shortly after Thomas Gainsborough died, and Joshua Reynolds by this time hadn't died but had stopped painting. But it was also the time when the young Thomas Lawrence, who we'll see next, was starting to exhibit his full-length paintings and building up a reputation for himself as a flamboyant artist. Not to everybody's liking, the flamboyancy, and the more conservative artist at the time that you would go to for a society painting was William Beachy. So he painted in the same style. He was an academician. Well, after this date, he became an academician. He was known for his conservative ways, his lack of extravagance, his lack of flamboyance, although in fact later his painting, Beachy's paintings, became changed from essentially the style of Joshua Reynolds, which is what we see here, more into the style of Thomas Lawrence. He retired, he didn't retire until 1836, so this was one of his early paintings. Let's move, I think we'll move on to Thomas Lawrence, who's the other side of the room here. This is a well-known portrait of Mrs. Siddons, Sarah Siddons, and she was the great tragic actress of the age of this period. You might remember, although I actually skipped over it, but you might remember that I showed a picture of the earlier, or the tragic actress, the famous tragic actress that Sarah Siddons replaced, and that was Marianne Yates. And I briefly showed, she was dressed in costume, and I briefly showed you in the last room a portrait by Tilly Kettle. So Marianne Yates retired, and her role as the greatest actress of the period was taken over by Sarah Siddons, and she specialized in dramatic readings and in Shakespearean tragedy, and Lady Macbeth was the character that made her name, the character that she played most often. She's also known as the person you might have read who famously fainted on first seeing the sight of the Elgin marbles when they were first displayed in London, because she was so overwhelmed with the beauty of them. I'll talk a little bit about, no, I think what I'll do is I'll come back to Sarah Siddons, and I'll talk a bit about Thomas Lawrence first, and then come back to her, because the two are connected, as we'll see. And I thought that to give you a clearer picture of Thomas Lawrence as an artist, he was a child prodigy, and one of these extreme child prodigies. He was painting portraits when he was 3 years old. He was supporting his whole family painting portraits by the age of 10. He was born in Bristol, and when he was 18, he travelled to London and fairly rapidly established himself as a fashionable portrait artist. He was he also received royal commissions. He was elected an associate of the Royal Academy at the youngest age possible, 22, and he was elected a full academician at the youngest age possible at the age of 24 in 1794. So that was a few years after this, perhaps his most famous painting, the one on the left, of Elizabeth Farren, also a well-known actress of the period. He painted this when he was 21, and so I'm displaying it because it's one of his earliest major pictures and one of those that made him famous. And some people think he never painted a better portrait than the one on the left. It's actually it's in America, I believe. What I wanted to show you, however, is his technique. So he's 21 years old. He's not really formally trained, and yet, if we look in close, this is the glove of Elizabeth Farren here, and her hand is holding her other glove. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is his brushwork. You can see, particularly here, these are just single brush strokes. He just put the brush down and flicked it around, dabbed it down here, and then he's got a different sort of brush. He's laid the ground, and then he's just used the brush, just a few flicks of the brush to create this here, which then, if we step back, magically turns into silk and fur. I've got one other enlargement, which is of her face, to show you how he used a similar brush strokes to create the hair, but he's taken more care over the construction of the face. You can see some brush strokes, but a lot of it has been carefully modeled. In fact, this was commissioned by I think it was the 12th Earl of Derby, who 7 years after this married Elizabeth Farren, and he didn't like the portrait. He thought it made her look too thin. Let me show you the whole thing again. One of the things I particularly like about this picture is I was showing you the brush strokes just to show his technique, but I think one of the things about this picture that grabs you is the pose, how she's just turning, twisting away from us and looking back. It's one of those pictures where he seems to have caught a moment in time, frozen time, if you like, and with just a few dabs of paint. And he painted rapidly. He painted the whole of society. He became the leading portrait painter. He has been described as one of the greatest British painters of the last 250 years. And he became well known across Europe as a leading portrait painter across Europe. He was the leading Regency portrait painter. He traveled to Italy. He, in 1820, became president of the Royal Academy, replacing Benjamin West, who had just died. He never married. Oh, and I was going to, let me get rid of Elizabeth Farren. I was going to come back and just finish by talking about the scandal. He was very well paid, Thomas Lawrence, in that he charged top amounts for his portraits. He painted a lot of portraits, so he must have earned a fortune. He didn't gamble or drink. But when he died, he almost went bankrupt, and it's a mystery. We don't know why. The best theory we have is that we know he never kept proper accounts. He either kept no accounts, he didn't know who to invoice or how much he'd been paid or whether he would have been paid. And we also know that he was very generous and gave money, lots of money, away to his family and to friends. So we can only think that, we know, and he also said of himself, he's never been extravagant or profligate. This is a quote: "I've never been extravagant or profligate in the use of money, neither gaming, horses, expensive entertainments, nor secret sources of ruin from vulgar licentiousness have swept it from me." So in a sense, this seems to be saying he didn't know where all the money went. I can only assume he gave it away. In fact, when he died, they sold his art collection and raised £15,000. That's the other way he spent money. He bought art. He loved buying art. He had a large art collection of old masters. So some of his money went on that. His reputation declined after his death during the Victorian period, but recently it's been restored. But I still haven't told you about why I came back to this picture. Mrs. Siddons had 7 children. In fact, she was often pregnant, and she still went on stage pregnant. So I think she must be one of the only actresses to play Lady Macbeth while pregnant, and visibly pregnant. And it was said at the time that this added a new dimension to the role of Lady Macbeth. But I've got off the point again. She had 2 daughters, Maria and Sally. Now, Thomas Lawrence fell in love with Sally, and they were going to get married. But Maria developed tuberculosis, and he transferred his affections to Maria. He fell in love, if you like, with Maria. She was very ill, but they got engaged, and her mother agreed to the marriage. But he then decided that he preferred Sally, and he broke off with Maria and turned to Sally again. Maria, on her deathbed, got Sally to promise never to see Lawrence again, which she promised, and kept to the promise. Maria died. She died when she was 19. So when he fell in love with them, they were very young. And Sally never saw Lawrence again, and died when, well, some authorities say she died when she was 24. I think she died when she was 28. So, but she died a few years later in 1803, the year, and surprisingly, throughout this series of events, Thomas Lawrence maintained his friendship with Mrs. Siddons, and she continued to see him despite the devastating effects on her daughters, and painted this in 1804, the year after Sally had died. Let me move on. Let me move on to this painting down here. By the way, you'll see in the gallery in certain rooms these tables. These are prints, and which are covered to prevent the light fading them, but feel free to lift up the covers. That's what you're meant to do. And if you lift up one of these covers, you'll see this print: Paul Sandby Munn, Bedlam Furnace. And it's showing a scene from, in fact, the birth of the Industrial Revolution. It's showing the scene at Bedlam Furnaces, or Madley Wood, and the furnaces belong to the Coalbrookdale Company, and that might remind you of another picture that I've shown before. Let me put it up briefly. Perhaps more famous, this is a painting in the Science Museum, Coalbrookdale by Night, by Lowtherbourg, Philip Lowtherbourg. And you can see, I won't compare it like for like, but I think they're both taken from roughly the same spot. There are slight differences, but some of these buildings look very, very similar. I'm showing that picture because I've shown it to you before. It's just a reminder of the scene we're looking at here is the same scene, and it's a representation both of the birth of the Industrial Revolution, which was to fuel, if you like, and the age of steam, to fuel the increasing power of Britain. But it's also an example of what was known as the Sublime. Now, the book to mention here, I think the one that describes the Sublime in the most detail is a book by Edmund Burke on the nature of the Sublime, a philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. The idea being that the sublime invokes feelings different from beauty, but which are also important feelings that can be captured in art. Now, at the time, Edmund Burke and others didn't distinguish, but I think a useful, in fact, I don't like the terms, but a useful distinction that's been made by a modern art theorist is between the feminine sublime and the masculine sublime. I must admit, I don't like the term feminine and masculine, but I think the distinction is important. The feminine sublime is associated with feelings of awe and rapture and spiritual feelings, the sort of feeling you might get in looking at a sunset, contemplating the vastness of nature. Whereas the masculine sublime is concerned with terror and domination, the feeling of terror that you might get, or they used to get in the 18th century when looking at mountains, or if you're looking down a drop, or seeing something filled with terror, as in fact we'll see in a moment. The later, 100 years later, end of the 19th century, these ideas of the sublime were abandoned by artists. It was thought to be not as interesting, lacking taste. But although some people say that it's resurrected itself recently in the interest in horror films, and horror in general is an example of wanting to be scared, if you like, invoking feelings which used to be invoked by scenes like this of the raw power of nature, and in this case created by man, the furnaces, the flames and so on. It's like looking into hell, if you like, but it's also at the same time producing something that is powering the nation. So it's full of ambiguities. Paul Munn, was a landscape painter, which is interesting because this is the beginning, this is 1803, this is the beginning of landscape. They're not obviously the earliest landscapes, but in Britain, we'll see one later, the landscapes of Thomas Gainsborough, for instance, were much earlier than this, but they weren't so popular. They were difficult to sell. The main type of painting that was commissioned and bought was the portrait. But Munn was so it started to become possible to be a landscape painter by 1803. In other words, you could sell enough to make a living. He exhibited at the Royal Academy, but also, like his father, he exhibited at the Old Society of Painters in watercolour. He was a friend of, you might have heard of John Sell Cotman. He was a friend of Cotman. They went on sketching holidays together. So let's go back to the room. I think that's enough background or a little introduction to landscape and to the sublime, which takes us on to a few examples of landscape, genre painting, and up here, the sublime. Let's start with the sublime. This is a sketch actually by Henry Fuseli, Lady Macbeth, there's also a link here with Sarah Siddons, Lady Macbeth seizing the daggers. This is the scene, I think it's Act 2, Scene 2 in Macbeth, when Macbeth has done the deed, killed Duncan, comes back into the room where Lady Macbeth is waiting for him. Just before he arrives, she thinks she hears a sound, the owl. And one of the first things he says as he comes in is, "I have done the deed. Didst thou not hear a noise?" And then she didn't hear him, and she wonders why, what she did hear. So it's starting to, the horror of what they have done is starting to play on their minds. And he says that when he was doing the deed, stabbing Duncan, the attendants in the other room, he heard them half wake up and say, "Did I hear a murder?" And the other one said, that we think said no, and they said a prayer. And then one of them said, "Amen." And Macbeth said, "I could not say amen." And then later he says, in this scene, he says, "Methought I heard a cry, sleep no more." At this point, Lady Macbeth is annoyed by his lack of purpose, and then she suddenly notices the dagger or daggers and is annoyed because he's meant to leave them behind to implicate the attendants. So she takes the daggers, goes back to the room, smears the sleeping attendants with blood, and then comes back. And we all know what happens later. But let me move on to a little bit about Fuseli, because he's not a very well-known artist, perhaps, but he was very significant at the time. Partly, he was born in Zurich and came to Britain later. He started life as a translator, translating French, German, Italian that he spoke fluently. And he also, as a young man, he studied Milton and Shakespeare. He had a classical education rather than an artistic education. He, after university, well, that's going into too much detail. He came to London and translated in London. And then as a translator, he met Joshua Reynolds and showed Joshua Reynolds some drawings he'd done. And Reynolds encouraged him to be trained as an artist and to go to Italy to learn. And he traveled to Rome, made friends with a group of artists, studied classical antiquities, studied Michelangelo, learnt to build up drama in a picture, changed his name to Fuseli, the spelling you see here, to fit in with the Italian way of spelling his German name. And he, came back to England and became a regular exhibitor at the Royal Academy. That's when he exhibited his most famous picture, The Nightmare, which you might remember, and was elected an associate of the Royal Academy, and then became a full academician, and then became professor of painting at the Royal Academy. And as professor of painting, this is where he perhaps had his biggest influence, because he he trained all of the famous artists we know of the period. He trained Turner, he trained Landseer, he trained William Blake. He was an inspiration. His pupils included Constable, Haydn, William Etty, and many others. So his style, he was picked up, particularly William Blake, by many of these artists who all thought highly of him. And in fact, when he died, another one of his friends, Antonio Canova, the sculptor, supported his election to the Academy of St. Luke in Rome. And that cemented his reputation as an academician and as a member of the Academy of St. Luke in Rome, the most prestigious academy in some ways in Europe, because it was the first to be created. And he became a leading international artist known across Europe. He died in Putney and he's buried in St. Paul's. He, interestingly, despite his reputation and his training, he's not noted as a colorist. He's a master of light and shadow, as you can see from this painting. He's excellent at capturing figures in motion, but he produced no landscapes. He said, "Damn nature, she always puts me out." And he only ever painted 2 portraits. So he's speciality was this, although this is a sketch, his speciality was this sort of painting, or the paintings like The Nightmare. Let me switch to a landscape. Sorry, I was just thinking about the time I've got left because I'm starting to run out of time now. This is George Mooreland, Roadside Inn. Now, George Mooreland is an artist that was a long way away from being an academician. He had one of the most interesting lives of almost any artist. He was, well, let me start at the beginning. He started to draw well when he was 3. He could copy to the extent that his father locked him in the attic and forced him to copy old masters, which he then sold. He was exhibited at the Royal Academy when he was 10. I said he was locked in the attic, but he wasn't put down by that. He did drawings that he hid from his father. He lowered them out of the window to his friends, who sold them, and he would then escape out of the window. They would spend all night getting drunk, and then he would come back the next day. He separated, he left home when he was 17, but by that stage, he was well known by dealers and artists across London. And so he could sell anything that he painted. And he specialized in painting landscapes like this, and particularly painting the lives of the poor. But anything he sold, anything he painted, he could sell, and he could paint very quickly. It's thought that by the end of his life, he had painted over 4,000 paintings. That's an incredible number. I mean, some well-known artists have painted 50, a few hundred, maybe on average 500 paintings. And it's even more surprising when I tell you more about his life. He switched between painting, and he painted a picture to make enough money to buy drink for himself and his friends, when he would drink for days and get till he was unconscious. And then when he woke again, he would have debts from all the drink that he'd bought everyone, and he would paint another picture. Now, he was surrounded by dealers because they knew that if they gave him enough money to pay off his debts and to buy the next round of drinks, I don't know, £5 or something, then he could live for a week on that, and he would take the money and give them the painting, which they could then sell for £25, £50, and so on. He didn't care. He just lived for drink, and he painted, but because he drank so much, he started to decline. But I've missed out a 10-year period in his life. He met and fell in love with Anne Ward, who, incidentally, you might have heard of James Ward, who painted Gordel Scar. Well, it's his daughter. She was virtuous and beautiful, and fell in love with him and managed to get him to stop drinking for 10 years. So there's in the 1780s, he was a reformed character, but by the early 1790s, he had left her and started drinking again. and his health declined. He managed to survive through the 1790s, but in 1799 his health was so poor that he could hardly paint. He was arrested for debt and taken into lodgings within the rules. That is, he was allowed to continue painting to pay off his debts, but he sank lower and lower, was drunk for days, generally slept on the floor. His health had been ruined, and he died aged 41. So by the age of 41, he'd painted 4,000 pictures, and his wife, Anne Ward, died 3 days later of, we'd probably say, a broken heart. It was on her death certificate was convulsive fits brought on by the news of his death. So that, as I said, was, although we look at this quiet landscape here, and although in many of his landscapes he shows the plight and lives of the poor, there you would, looking at this apparently innocuous landscape, you would have no idea of the life of the artist who painted these paintings. How are we doing for time? Very quickly, George Wilkie, the blind fiddler, David Wilkie. David Wilkie became extremely famous. He was trained in Edinburgh, came to London, painted in the sort of Dutch style like David Tenier, and made famous that's the wrong way of putting it, but made fashionable this style of genre painting, or what's sometimes called subject painting or narrative painting, a painting with a story. He was one of the first to start painting these, and during the 19th century, we're now in the 19th century, they became very popular, particularly in engravings. People would put on their walls, tell a story, often with a moral point, often humorous. We can see the baby here. We can see over here, someone is they're all listening to the blind fiddler, but over here the boy is with a piece of stick, is playing a pair of bellows in imitation, so humor, and often a moral tale. He became very well known for his most famous painting, the Chelsea pensioners reading the Waterloo Dispatch, and he was paid 1,200 guineas cash for the painting. It was commissioned by the Duke of Wellington, who paid him the 1,200 guineas. So he became wealthy and extremely famous. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy, and it was the first painting to be exhibited there, where they had to install a rail in front of the painting to stop the crowds pushing forward and pushing people into the painting. People were so keen that, I'm not talking about the blind fiddler, the Chelsea pensioners, they were so keen to identify people in the picture and to talk about what was going on and how they received the news of the victory at Waterloo. That really made his name. He became a painter to George IV, and later William IV and Queen Victoria, although Queen Victoria didn't like his portraits that much. He wasn't much of a success with Victoria, but he was knighted. He later in life, he made a trip, a journey, a holiday, a working holiday to the Holy Land, where he made many sketches, which I would assume he intended to turn into paintings on his return, but he died on the steamer home and was buried at sea. Spent a bit too long on Wilkes. I won't tell you about the life of George Wright of Derby, because he's a much more famous artist. You're probably aware of his candlelit pictures and his representations of sort of scientific scenes, dramatic scientific experiments. But here's a different sort of painting. So Brooke Boothby amateur poet and philosopher who is sitting in a wood on his estate called the 20 Oaks, which is the wood where his friend, Boothby's friend, Rousseau, the philosopher, sat and wrote and read, and he's celebrating the use of the wood by sitting there himself in the pose. You might wonder why he's lying on the ground. This is the convention, in those days, conventional pose of the melancholic. A little bit more about melancholy in a moment, but just to point out, his finger here is pointing, you won't be able to read it in this reproduction, but that says Rousseau. So it's representing the works of Rousseau, this book here. So he's pointing to his hero, Rousseau. He's in the natural world. And the idea is he was interested in botany and in the natural world. And this is a return to nature, because Rousseau believed that we are all fundamentally good and that it's civilization that corrupts us. So the idea of returning to nature is returning to the primitive and returning to the original innocence. But on the melancholic side, going back to antiquity, melancholia was associated with what we would call depression. So it was thought to be a disturbance in the humours. Too much black bile resulted in depression. However, in the 16th, 17th and 18th century, it became associated through the writings of one and then later several people, associated with genius, artistic genius. So the artistic genius was thought to be someone who had amazing highs, but then depression, melancholic lows. But many aspiring artists, if you like, showed themselves, as we see here, in the melancholic pose, often with their head in their hand or hands, often lying in the ground, across the ground, and often in nature, and often with a stream or brook running by. This is the classic melancholic pose, representing not so much depression, but the idea of artistic genius. Let me move on, because what have we got? I've got 10 minutes roughly, and I must talk about this picture and these pictures here. Let me start with these by Stubbs. Two pictures by Stubbs, the Reapers and the Haymakers. I'll show you both, but one at a time. He worked on these. He produced an early version, which is at Upton House, which you might have seen. But he did numerous sketches. In fact, he did many sketches which were thrown away when he died. So we don't have them, but we know from inventory at the time that he produced many sketches of the Haymakers and the Reapers, and these have become known as some of his best known works. Of course, Stubbs is best known for his depiction of horses, and he spent a year dissecting horses and in a remote farm, and producing a book, The Anatomy of the Horse. In other words, he studied the structure of the musculature and bone structure of the horse in intimate detail. The reason for that is that at the time, you've got to remember that the means of transport was the horse, and so everybody interacted with, came across horses all the time, and the aristocracy bred horses, and they almost loved their horses more than their wives. They wanted a accurate portrait of their studs, of their their best horses. And so Stubbs, who could paint an accurate picture of their horse, was much in demand. But he also, during this period, the 1780s, tried to move away, that landscapes and rural subjects were becoming more popular because of Gainsborough, because of Mooreland, and Stubbs wanted to move into this genre, this type of painting. And that's one of the reasons he sought to refine these landscapes. Now, I can only begin to talk about, books have been written about these paintings, the haymakers and the reapers. The reason is because, or the debate surrounds the accuracy of the depiction of the workers. This is one of the first times that anyone had shown people at work relatively close up. And so it's a representation of the working poor, and the arguments surround, are they really working poor or are they idealized? Is there a secret message here about the increasing importance of the poor, represented, if you like, by the woman in the center, standing akimbo, hand on her waist with this upright pole she's handing. The pictures have also been analysed formally, because you'll notice that compared with this picture, there's more characters, but there's, and this Upton House picture is earlier. It's a much stronger pyramidal structure, so classical, very strong pyramid structure in this picture, going up to this point and then coming all the way down here through the horse's head. And that is a sort of a classical, so he's introduced a very strong classical compositional element combined with this forthright figure in the center looking out. Now, is it idealized? Well, their clothes are much cleaner than they would have been. If you look, there's no sign of dirt on any of their clothing, but we now know that what they were wearing was fashionable of the period. And if you look at the hats, I'm sorry, the reproduction isn't very good, but if you look at some of the hats in this picture, they are different from the hats in this picture. And that represents the changing fashion over a 2-year period. Fashions changed annually. And we know from research that rural workers in the fields would wear the latest fashion. They were starting to earn enough money to follow the fashion. Oh, I'm run out of time. Hold on. Let me just finish with this painting. I wanted to finish with Gainsborough. This is a well-known ballerina of the period, Giovanni Bacelli, and she was the mistress of the Duke of Dorset. He commissioned this painting, but Gainsborough painted a picture of him, the Duke of Dorset, and which he was going to exhibit at the Royal Academy the same year as this painting of his mistress. But the Academy thought that this wouldn't be proper, and for reasons of decorum, they didn't exhibit the portrait of the Duke. They exhibited this one instead. She was well known as the mistress of the Duke. Incidentally, the Duke, who was John Sackville, lived at Knowle House, that somewhere you might have visited, near Sevenoaks, and he wasn't married. She was his mistress, and later they went to France, where, because he was appointed ambassador to France, he was awarded the Blue Garter ribbon. And it's said that when she danced at the Paris Opera, she was a well-known dancer, ballerina across Europe. She wore his Blue Garter ribbon round her head. So he went along with that. They were very close. But when they came back to England, to Knowle, because of the French Revolution in 1789, that's the year they came back, She left her son behind with him. They remained friends. She developed a close friendship with the Earl of Pembroke, and they remained together until her death in 1801. It was thought at the time that this captured her personality. She was small, quick, and light, and one critic said she wasn't regarded as beautiful at the time. One critic said that as the original, light, airy, and elegant of this painting. And then I just, for those of you who've been to Knowle, the sculpture at the bottom of the stairs, which is still there, or last time I went was still there, by Locatelli, the Italian artist, is of, it's Giovanni Locatelli, sculpture of Giovanni Bacelli. And that's still, if you go there, you'll still see it at the bottom of the stairs. It's the same person. So that comes to, I think I've gone a minute over today. So